Now the next thing is basically the incident response phase. And essentially what happens is something happens. You're prepared, and then something happens that causes you to put your preparation into effect. For example, it requires that the digital investigation staff be on site, just like the example we talked about this morning. Now that may happen with very little amount of preparation time. You may be dispatched immediately, or you've wheels up in 30 minutes if you've seen NCIS and some other shows. So you need to get the gear from here to there. In the case of the example this morning, if you're here and the place to be investigated is in Denver, chances are you're not going to drive 1,700 miles to get out to Colorado. So what position are you in to transfer the stuff? As I said in the back room are the Pelican cases. We have bunches and bunches of Pelican cases, flyaway kits, and all this stuff we can check on an airplane and go. All you need is hotel and car and all those other things. Plus, once you get there, you have to put it in something, like a big SUV, a big Suburban, something like that. We've used those. One of the other, so we'll talk about some of that. Internet connectivity and buying things on the fly, et cetera, need the authority to obtain information. We talked about this morning. When you're out there, what are you going to image? What are you going to take? Search warrants, policies, whatever, government laws, or reach back to someone who can help you interpret laws while you're in the field. The key is to know what you're looking for, because you probably can't go out and go fishing. Search warrants tend to be very specific. You're looking for credit card information from this site on this machine, if you can find it to the exclusion of all else. That's what you're dealing with. So one of the things that happens as soon as you get your marching orders, and we talked about this morning a little bit, is this notion of reconnaissance. What can you determine before you get on site? Talked about physical plans, talked about all sorts of things. But it would have been helpful to know this web server in the example, in the exercise example, what operating system is it? Is it a Linux box? Is it a Windows box? Is it a Mac OS box? Is it an IBM 370? What is it that you're going to be attempting to image? So it's nice to know some amount of that in advance. Whatever IP address ranges, whatever OS, whatever you can determine about the system before you get there can give you a leg up for doing that. By the same token, no matter what you determine in advance, I have been in situations where that has proven not to be accurate. For example, there are some browsers that you can use where you change the browser identification string. So you browse with like Google, and the other end appears to be Internet Explorer. So there are ways to perturb the operating system so that it responds in a way that points you in an opposite direction. You think it's Linux and it's really Windows, for example. So what we have done is that we have maintained this catalog of virtual machines using VMware. And as soon as we do a recon on a new site that needs a new VM, we build a new VM and we build the tools that we need, burn them to a CD, burn them to a USB, burn them to a hard drive, and we take them with us. And we've contemplated taking that catalog of VMs with us as well, so that if we need something on the fly, we can build it there without reach back. So yes, take it on site, or no, use the reach back, and if you have people back in the office who can do that for you. So once you get out there, and what this slide talked about here was normally what happens is the victim organization will do an amount of the incident response, but then you get into the investigative part, and that's typically performed by the flyaway staff who actually helps in the investigation. So now you're out there, you've got your kits, you brought everything with you, you've done your reconnaissance, and now you're on site. And so what is it that you need to image? What is it that you want to take back once you've discovered what it is that you're looking for? And oh, by the way, with respect to the exercise today, here are two things that I am aware of that we have done to determine that pizza box in a place where you can't figure out where it is. One of them is, if you look on the back of some of these computer systems, you'll see when the Ethernet receives a packet, there's an LED on the back that flashes. So imagine, since you know the IP address in this case, you can ping that IP address at 1 second intervals and just start looking through the racks for an LED that shuts on and off every 1 second. That would be a clue that that's a non-invasive way to do it. Another way that one of our guys has done, somebody said this morning, was to leverage a vulnerability to gain access to the machine and then open the CD tray. A lot of these pizza boxes will have a CD tray built into it. Just open it and then have your staff walk around looking for the CD tray that's open, and that's the machine. There may be other ways to do it. If it has a speaker, you could cause it to emit an audible sound that gives you some clues. But the ping is the, quote, non-invasive way where you can actually see the LEDs on the back. We actually had some people who had to do that at a colo facility with a gazillion machines out on the West Coast, and they just went to the back and started looking. Sometimes the easiest, most brute force way is the way to do it. So then you're out there, you've gained access to the machine. The search warrant allows you to image what's necessary, whatever that means. So what's necessary? There's all of these places where information can be stored. It's just not computers and hard disks anymore. You have memory in a printer. You have memory in a copier, which is basically a printer. LG does happen to make an internet connectable refrigerator. So it could be something like that. My opinion, if I were to keep some contraband information, I would burn it onto CDs and DVDs labeled like movies and store them over in this part of my house where I've got my video collection, even though they're data CDs, because people probably wouldn't look at them. But you can find USBs and all sorts of things. There are USB connections in sunglasses. There's a USB connection in a watch. I don't know, perhaps you've seen over the course of the last week a Swiss Army knife with a 1 terabyte SSD drive built into it for $3,000. I've been to conferences where the people have explained women's barrettes have USB, articles of underclothing have USB connection. Who's going to attempt to look at that material as somebody walks out the door? So you can find them in all sorts of things, and what you end up imaging or taking can be fairly wide, at least in terms of what could be imaged. These little discs that are in cell phones, that are in cameras, all sorts of those. The idea here is to image what you need to image and image efficiently, because chances are you can't be there forever. It was in fact the case when we were in New York City that the assistant U.S. attorney said, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you got to leave. You've been there 4 hours. We did the search warrant at 10 o'clock, so we had to leave. So you need to image efficiently. So how much disk space exists in the organization? How long would it take to image all of it? And can you be more selective in what you figure out to image? I have been in the place where we did not do this as well as we could have, and to actually sit down and make a full-fledged imaging plan. Now, what it is that you're imaging is you are imaging the space that the suspect could have stored things at the time that the crime was alleged to have committed. Now, just like the joke I told you this morning about the guy who was looking for his watch under the light, how do you know what disk space you were allowed to write on 6 months ago? And how has that changed over the course of 6 months? Maybe your access permissions have changed, and the fact that you can write on this disk today doesn't mean that you could have written on it 6 months ago. So the challenge in many cases is to figure out what was accessible to the suspect in the time when the crime was committed. So once you make up an imaging plan, you need to figure out what it is that you want to image and then how you're going to image it. We ran into a place where the systems were very old, which meant they had USB 1 capabilities, but the network was very fast. So it made a lot more sense to image those drives over the net than it did to image even to a local disk. And then all of a sudden you may have to stop because of some reason, outside of your ability to control that. So the order in which you image things, the most likely to the least likely, to make sure that you can walk out the door with what you're looking for. And then, as someone said this morning, and rightfully so, you got to image it somewhere. You need disks. They need to be wiped. You may run out of disks. If you run out of disks, you need to acquire more disks. Do you know where the local Best Buy is? Do you know where the local Walmart is? Do you have a credit card that you can go off and buy those things? Do you have a machine that can wipe those disks very quickly so that you can put them in service, et cetera, et cetera? And if you spend time preparing all of this, and I remember once we finally got to this, it was on a whiteboard. and we were just ticking it off. You know, you're doing this one, you're doing this one, you're doing this one. Write it down when you start it, write it down when you finish it. I want to know what to predict how much more time we need to be on site so that everybody's doing something. I went ahead and did that. So the challenge is there from the time something happens until data collection starts? That's your incident response plan. Did something really happen? What's the nature of the assessment? If you're going to have a mitigation strategy from an incident response plan, what does it take to get it running? And formulate the investigative plan. Now you're into data collection. So now we're in the next phase. Now we're actually going to collect stuff. We've made the plan. Now we're going to go ahead and do that. You're looking for a few things, 3 things. Host-based evidence, traditional disks. You're looking at any network-based evidence if that's still relevant. And you may be looking for removable media, whatever that turns out to be. So you want to see if there's some notion of a host network monitoring capability that you can turn on, because if you're imaging live systems, somebody may be attempting to get into those systems to destroy the evidence while you're trying to image it. It would be nice to know that. Maybe there's a wireless access point sitting in the machine room that they use for out-of-band access. And then this whole notion of evidence handling. Okay, so that's what we're going to do here. So you want to capture all of the host-based information that you need. And the best, of course, is if it's at rest, which means it's turned off, because that's guaranteed to be at rest. But that doesn't always work, especially in the face of encryption. If you turn off something that's encrypted, you've lost your access to it. If it's like an encrypted RAID drive, something, a TrueCrypt container, et cetera, et cetera. The best things to use for imaging are things that copy bit for bit, so that there is no interpretation of the file system, et cetera, et cetera. DD is the Unix disk-to-disk copy program that's available everywhere, and there are variants of those. One is DC3DD and DCFLDD. Are other ones to do that, as well as FTK Imager. And you never really ever want to use programs that interpret the file system, although we have done that in the case of dumping a database that used 1% of a 3 terabyte disk. We could have imaged the 3 terabytes. It would have taken a long time, so we just captured the relevant information. Now, when you image something, you typically can compute a checksum. Imagine that the thing that you're imaging has a disk error, and every time you image it, you get a different checksum. And so how do you record that information? Well, there's got to be a hunk of information before the disk error and a hunk of information after the disk error, and maybe you copy it as 2 hunks and do checksums of the individual hunks so that it's reproducible. Capturing network data. The notion of headers versus full packet captures. The prevailing wisdom has been this thing called running TCP dump and capturing 68 bytes of a packet. Now, the first 68 bytes of a packet will almost always give you the header, the complete header. Unfortunately, in certain circumstances, like UDP packets, which have an 8-byte header, it will give you part of the body of the message as well, and that may be out of bounds for what you're allowed to do. So the key word here is net flow. If you look at net flow data and things that can record net flow, essentially net flow is a summary of a connection. Source port, destination port, start time, end time, number of bytes, and that's all it keeps, and it gives you that summary record and total number of bytes sent. So that can be an important way to get only the header information and guaranteed not to get anything else. There's lots of public domain and commercial tools that capture net flow information. Things like Cisco's devices can actually record net inflow information. You can ask for it. And there's lots of public domain and commercial tools that process net flow information. Again, it's network summary information, not packet content. So you have to record this information somehow. You may need a connection of these kind of devices to attach onto a network to get to it. Cables, wires, maybe taps, connecting to the drain port on a firewall or a router where all the traffic goes to that port, and then begin to do your collection. So you collect, and again, you still have to put it somewhere. So you need a disk connected to it. We did one with a Mac connected to a local SATA drive in the one site that we were in. Then you go off and perform the imaging. You need something to image to. If you're doing dead disks, you need write blockers. What a write blocker is a contraption that sits between the disk and the thing that's reading the disk to guarantee that you can't write to that disk. It blocks the writing operation. You need write blockers. You need things to write to. You need software to do it. You need some mechanism of verifying the image. And you need something to put the image in, note-taking materials and such, so that you can record everything that you're doing. And you need donuts and you need coffee. And then you need more donuts. Because a lot of this stuff takes a lot of time. There's no two ways about it. Once you've copied some information, you need to verify your copy, which means checksums. You can run checksums on a block-by-block basis, which gives you a huge amount of data. You can write a checksum on the whole device, which most like FTK and other tools will do and understand for you. Record that information in a journal, timestamp it, and the problem I talked about before is what if there's a disk error? Is there a way to get around that disk error? Maybe a hunk followed by another hunk for checksums.
In MD5, MD5 it's pretty easy to produce collision on MD5. I mean, it's a matter of a couple of seconds actually to produce all. You just take whatever string you want, you produce it.
So what you're saying is it's possible to have two data sources that produce the same checksum?
I mean, if they wanna do something, they just produce fake files which hash to the same MD5 hash.
That's computationally the case. When we distribute, if you went to the CERT website, we distribute a collection of tools. For example, Crypt Hunter is one of those tools that looks for encrypted devices. And I built I built an ISO image, and that's what we actually distributed. Contained in that ISO image is a readme.txt. Contained in that readme.txt is an MD5 and a SHA hash of each file. So I'm using two hashing techniques. So I think what we're saying here is don't rely on one. Compute a checksum a couple of different ways. That way the likelihood of one of them being broken, as you say, is much less relevant. So yes, it's possible to actually make MD5 collisions. Rare, but possible. So SHA-256, SHA-512, one of those others. Hash it a bunch of ways. Good point. Okay. So as a bad person, and I have a collection of these in this, I call these counter-forensic tips. The idea here is this is what some of the bad people are doing to try to defeat what you as somebody who's doing acquisition is trying to do. And that is, let me encrypt my disk. BitLocker, TrueCrypt. If you use Linux, you can use Lux, L-U-K-S. FreeBSD has a mechanism. Let me encrypt the disk. If the machine's powered off, it's a boat anchor. You can't do anything with it. So how do you, as the person who's doing the acquisition, determine that there is encryption that you need to deal with? Or can I just turn off the machine? That tool is called Crypt Hunter. And it is a tool that runs under Windows. And it's a tool that as a law enforcement person you can download, you can apply for and download from our website, and I'm the one who processes those requests. And basically it's a CD with an executable on it that you install, and it tells you if there's active encryption on the system, which is a clue that you should not turn the system off, that you need to image it because the encrypted version is available to you. Okay? Tiny footprint, standalone software. This is the URL, and this is what it looks like. It's a red light, green light. You turn it in and you run it, and it comes off and says there is an encrypted volume that may be mounted, which is a clue to not turn the machine off. You need to do something in the meantime. It only warns of active encryption. That is to say, if it's a TrueCrypt container that's not mounted, it's not going to tell you that. But if it is mounted, it will say that there is a mounted volume and you need to deal with that. So these are the set of encrypting software that TrueCrypt understands. And we wrote this for our law enforcement partners so that they can figure this stuff out. Yes?
That's dependent on you having credentials to log on to the system to run.
That is correct.
But if you don't have credentials to log on to the system, then
And then it's more challenging. Then you have to get credentials. Here's what we did in one case when we didn't have credentials. You know what FireWire is? It's a type of connection. FireWire has a unique characteristic that it gives you full DMA access to physical memory. We ran a tool, and I can't think what the name of the tool is because it's Friday and I'm tired, but there is a name of a tool where we actually injected code into the operating system that popped up a command.exe on the lock screen. We actually did this. And I'll find the name and get back to you. But I think it may be a public domain tool that's able to do that. So in that case, we did that. We started a command.exe on the locked console. Then we had command line access to the system. And it's called Nemo. The Disney character.
Like the Disney.
Yeah. And so that's a way to deal with that. So as we talked about before lunch.
You use the method was Nemo
Yes.
to inject the code.
Yes. Under Windows. We did that under Windows. And so what we did on this one system was the machine was up. Whatever encryption was up in its decrypted phase, there was a screensaver that was active. We used Nemo on the FireWire port to inject code to pop up a command line tool on the windows of the on the console of the machine. We then used command line tools to look around, including putting in a CD and running CryptHunter, which we could run from the command line to see what it had to say.
Now this was an earlier version of Windows, not Windows 7, which the default command does not have privileges, right?
I believe the way that we injected the code into this, it came up with administrative privileges. So, I mean, I was there. I saw him do it. It turned out it was on a Windows 60 or was a 64-bit Windows system, and we did all of that. And then the challenge becomes, as I said with this WeBTech hot plug, you need something that continues to jiggle the mouse. Otherwise, the screensaver kicks in again, and you've lost it. It's not clear that you can inject the same code again and get another command prompt to come up. So you need to be aware of that. But we did that. We did that at midnight until 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. We've been successful doing that under Windows. And chances are good that what you're going to run into in most places is Windows.
Would you be able to replicate that in a virtual environment?
I'm sure that they tested that. Yes. Yes. Anyway, so assuming you've got credentials in some fashion, these are the kinds of encryption mechanism that CryptHunter will find. And if you're law enforcement, you can have this tool for free. And if you're not law enforcement, it doesn't mean you can't. It's just apply for it anyway. Or government. Okay. Under Linux systems, unfortunately, there are no automated tools. And you have to know something about it. Again, assuming you can get credentials, you can look around, you can see if something is mounted using LUX, which is the Linux Unified Key System. Under Linux, it comes with Fedora and others. Geely is a standard encryption mechanism under BSD, and TrueCrypt is a public domain that runs under Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. You can have TrueCrypt containers. We talked earlier about Dropbox. I have a Dropbox. That contained in that Dropbox is an encrypted container. So I use TrueCrypt. I connect Dropbox. I essentially loop back, decrypt that with TrueCrypt, and I can put information in there that as it sits out in the cloud is encrypted. So I can put in whatever I want to do. So the challenge here with Linux is to be able to gain credentials, same problem, and then to be able to recognize what's there. Excuse me. And here's the answer to your question. What if there's a screensaver?
Have you ever come across a time when you had to pick up the terminals in TrueCrypt when you can have another encrypted
A nested encrypted container?
nested encrypted?
Yeah, that would work.
No, but have you ever come across that? Like, where
I personally have not,
like
but I've heard the
where
guys.
somebody-
I've heard other people talking about that, where they've had encryption inside of encryption inside of encryption. And CryptHunter will find those, assuming that they're all active, which means that the decrypted version is mounted. Because in the Windows world, they're all mounted and there's still a drive somewhere, an H drive, a Q drive, or something. And that's what CryptHunter keys off of, is finding drives that are mounted that are not attached to physical drives, but are attached to virtual drives like containers. But yes, we have seen that. Multiple levels of encryption. And of course they use different keys, which is what you'd expect. Yeah. So this is Nemo, and we actually did this in one case. I've seen it done in one case. It's been done in other cases. This is what some of you talked about earlier. So now there's no firewire. You have no mechanism. So perhaps you have to leverage a vulnerability to gain access. Change the state of the computer to minimize the footprint in doing that, and then you begin to look for signs of encryption. So you simply need to be aware that encryption is being used by more and more people to hide information, to defeat the idea of powering the box off and letting you do a dead box imaging.
I did an exercise where we had a true encrypted partition, and we knew that the drive was a certain size, and when we were able to gain a password to enter, we realized that the size of the partition that we entered was smaller than the actual size of the drive, so we knew that we were in the nested encrypted portion.
Okay.
So that was interesting.
Then you get into host protected areas where the size of the drive is, you get into all sorts of funny things. Yeah. Okay. Counterforensic tip 3. There's important stuff in memory, like passwords, or perhaps keys in some form. If the clear text password is not in there, you may see a version of the keys that are built in memory, and that can be mined out. And essentially what happened was, with the one case that I'm familiar with that I was not part of, they gained access to the keys, even though the drives were locked. The screen was locked. The drives were locked. They gained access to the keys by pulling data structures out of the kernel. And then they went over to the suspect, who thought everything was fine, and said, here's your password for the drive. And he said, you got me. And so there was no prosecution. There was nothing to do at that point, because he already admitted that he'd done it. We had found sufficient evidence to indicate that if we did decrypt it, which we could because we had the key, that we were going to find what we were looking for, and it was clear that he was at fault. So in that case, we convinced the suspect, who agreed that he was dead. We had him nailed in that case. It's happened. So then the challenge becomes, there's good stuff in memory. You need to image memory. So there are tools for doing that in Windows. On Linux, it's more of a challenge. On Linux, you have to actually add something to the kernel called fmem to allow you to read all of physical memory from within Linux. And once you've read that memory, you have to do something with it, like interpret the data structures. There's some public domain software called the Volatility Framework. And with a volatility framework, which is essentially scripts, Python scripts, you can walk through memory and reconstruct what happened, like rebuild the process table. And there's lots of good information to explain how to use that. Okay. And if you happen to have a Fedora box, there's a repository of forensic tools that I maintain. It's called the CERT Linux Forensic Tools Repository. It's on cert.org/forensic/repository, available for Fedora 13 through 16 plus CentOS and Red Hat, and volatility is included in that. You can install it on your tools, on your Red Hat and Fedora systems. So here's one thing that we weren't dead, but we made our jobs harder, and that is we imaged everything, we got everything we wanted, but we did not check what we had before we walked out the door. And what we had gotten was we had gotten log files from a router that were in a binary format. And we had to do an awful lot more work to mine data out of that. We could have said, gee, can you give that to us in ASCII? And it was simply a flag given to the program that replicates the logs. And we would have been a lot easier to do that. So the point is you've taken all this, you've done your imaging plan, you brought all your hardware, you took your time, you bought your donuts, you ate your donuts, you drank your coffee, but what you walked out of the door with was completely unusable. So before you leave, check that stuff. Yes?
Is there a set amount of time that you have, a predetermined set amount of time that you have to examine the data you have? The data you obtain? Like, is there some statute of limitation?
I understand the question. It seems like forensic exams, once it's in the system, take 6 months. Maybe there is. I'm not aware of that. I can't say definitively yes or no.
Does it become like legally unadmissible at a certain point?
It depends on the jurisdiction. There are limitations, and the judge can also limit.
I suspect there's a statute of limitations for the crime, so that if you took 6 years to investigate something, that's going to be too long. But it would be more the crime rather than processing the data.
Often they'll say that the exam has to start before a certain window is up at the time of seizure.
Yeah.
60 days, 90 days.
That I've heard. So what I'm saying here is to check the stuff before you go out the door, because once you leave, now you've done the warrant and you have to start all over again. And frankly, if you were imaging me and calling me a bad person and then you left, I would consider making the likelihood of success if you returned much less, so that if you had to come back, whatever evidence was there would no longer be there. So you got one shot, is my point. So that's the collection phase. All this stuff to do beforehand, know how to do it efficiently and have the right stuff. Make the plan. The plan is very important because you may get all of a sudden pulled out and you may have to leave with whatever you have. Image, host, and network data, make sure you check it, and then secure transport, because now you own it. Now the chain of custody rules kick in, and you need to take care of that from the moment you're done imaging it until you're done with it throughout the rest of the case. And don't forget to document. Don't rely on your memory in your head for what's going on. Okay, so now you practiced, you did all your stuff, you flew away to Denver, you captured everything, you figured out your imaging plan, you walked away with an image of the disk, which you checked, you walked away with an image of memory, which you ran volatility on, and checked that in fact it was a real live memory image and that you could actually mine data out of it. And now you put it in your boxes, you've got all your paperwork, now you're going back on the plane, you're heading back to DC to put it in your system. Good.